I'm 12 Tone. You're awesome. And I feel like Anthony Fantano made a video about me. Anthony Fantano, the
The
internet's
internet's
busiest
busiest music
music
nerd.
nerd, recently interviewed Liz Pelly, an awesome music journalist, about Spotify, the dominance of Spotify, the rise of Spotify and all the negatives that have come with that. And I feel like every topic they hit on spoke to my chill lo-fi music project, Ciao Ciao Marigold. Ciao Ciao is about a 2-year-old project that I've been working on. In the calendar year 2024, Ciao Ciao got about 9.8 million streams on Spotify alone. So I feel like all these topics that Anthony Fantano and Liz Pelly are talking about in this video are extremely high stakes for me. And so I wanted to color it in a little more with my experience and agree and disagree with certain things that they were talking about. So let's watch the video.
You really do kind of like go back years and years and years to kind of like give a great and a very accurate picture of how exactly we got to this point and how something like Spotify coming out of this culture in Sweden that was so based around piracy. I was actually kind of blown away to learn that there was like even a political party like based around sort of, you know, how rampant piracy was around that time. There was, you know, a whole political movement around it because it was such a big discussion, and Sweden became such a huge focus point for the music industry because of just how crazy the piracy culture was over there.
Yeah, I feel like the way it's been described over the years, the way I talk about it in my book and how other writers have talked about it is that, Spotify was sort of happy to align itself with piracy when it made them seem cool, and when it sort of, made them seem like disruptors to massive number of music fans who really like piracy. And then they were happy to align with the music business when they were trying to get their license deals that they needed to launch their beta product, or when they were trying to get the labels on board with their whole model. Like you said, saving the music industry didn't end up being the same thing as saving music. And for a lot of independent musicians, a lot of these questions that they were asking pre-streaming are sort of questions that are musicians in some ways are still asking today.
So first things first, the book that they're mentioning is Liz Pelly's new book, Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Cost of the Perfect Playlist. I'm loving this book. I highly recommend it. And then just to speak about this phrase of like saving the music industry, because I grew up in the 90s and 2000s. I was a Napster user, a LimeWire user, a Kazaa user. If you were there, you know what I'm talking about. Let's just use Napster as the catch-all for these music piracy platforms. Basically, the music industry was going in one direction. It was doing very well. CDs, big labels, the checks were fat, but the access to those checks was very limited. It was a very difficult music industry to get into. I know firsthand, trying back then. So in terms of like saving the industry, it's like saving what? Saving like a very limited, corrupt, fat industry. In a way, I'm very happy that Napster came along and kind of destroyed what was before. I'm not happy that music overall has been devalued, but I'm also not in a rush to get back to like saving the music industry. So I think like let's just keep in mind while we talk about the problems that Spotify has brought on, that it was like a phoenix rising from the ashes in a way of this like destroyed industry where we didn't know really where to go next. And also just like another piece of context is like, not only was like the CD and the cassette and all physical forms destroyed and left behind when we jumped over to the internet, but also Apple, which dominated music online for so long with iTunes and the iPod and all that stuff, they, over the last like 15, maybe even you could say 20 years, they've really faded away, faded into the background. But Steve Jobs really revolutionized things with iTunes when they decided to make an online accessible library where people did pay for the music, and they paid $1 per track, which we forget is just a number that Steve Jobs made up out of his mind. So There was no real big calculating doing about what's fair, what would save the industry, what would help the industry. There was no negotiation. It was all pretty Wild Westy back then. This is the context that Spotify was able to jump in, get a foothold, and then build. So in a way, they were a disruptor. They were radical, and there was something cool about it. And then it kind of maybe evolved into something a little less cool.
No, I mean, there's even a point when you're talking about kind of like the prime playlisting, human playlisting era of Spotify, that you even sort of like dug up some connections that some people on that wing of the company had to like, the traditional radio programming industry, which, I thought was like kind of a revelation, because there have been times in the past when looking at Spotify playlists and kind of personally myself observing the kind of effect Spotify's curation was having on people's tastes, is sort of, to me, like rung like, why does this feel like the 2000s Clear Channel Viacom era all over again in terms of like how it's dictating people's tastes? Like it sort of feels like once again we've gone back to this homogenization of and siloing of people's access and exposure to different types of music.
So interesting to go back and trace to, like when the platform started to grow, when the executives at Spotify through the mid 2010s were thinking about growing beyond their initial consumer base. So like the first people to sort of jump on board with this model, or some of their early adopters, as they call them, were really enthusiastic music fans. But at a certain point, the company realized that it had to grow beyond just those maybe independent music fans or people who are really into music, and reach a more mass mainstream audience, as they explained it at the time. And part of that growth and trying to reach listeners beyond just enthusiasts was part of what drove their efforts to become more of like a curated service, playlists, mood-based recommendations, more personalized recommendations. It's what some people have called like the shift towards curation that happened around the end of 2012 into 2013. And the people that were sort of like chosen to lead these initiatives weren't necessarily like journalists and editors at first. It was people who had connections to, like you said, hit predicting and the mainstream songwriting worlds, things like that. Like in the early days of the Spotify playlist economy, artists were really sold on this idea that the Spotify playlisting ecosystem was this data-driven meritocracy, and they refer to it, and they still refer to it as like, this syndicate model based on a broadcast radio model, where there's these feeder playlists at the bottom, and they like put, they'll try out artists on these like less popular feeder playlists, and then they look at the data and see what's performing, and if songs are performing, they'll increasingly move them up to more mid-tier playlists, and then
Right.
the top of the playlist being like today's top hits. Well, one, I feel like there's so much baked into that in terms of like thinking about that's such a specific way to think about music and culture, and it has specific values associated with it. It's a specific like idea of curation that's being advanced there. But then also talking to people who worked at independent record labels and independent musicians at the time, a lot of them were just like totally mystified by this, and said that they never really saw like the magic of this playlist pyramid working out in their favor.
Right.
Playlists obviously are a very dominant topic in the music industry if you're a musician trying to rise up, but they weren't always, and it's important to remember that. This thing Liz is getting at about Spotify kind of framing it in a meritocratic way, I think is like super valid and super important to remember, because it wasn't that long ago that they were putting out videos. I mean, you can still find them on YouTube on Spotify official channels, where they're saying, we listen to every playlist pitch whenever you submit music. We build it up from the bottom. If we put it on a lower playlist, if we choose it for a playlist, we'll build it up in this pyramid metaphor. That's not Liz's metaphor. That's the metaphor that Spotify offered musicians for years. And you know, the only thing that I would kind of color in about this meritocracy thing is it's not about the best music making it to the top, obviously. It's about the music that gets the best data. So, you know, it technically, if you look at it from another way, it's not a meritocracy at all. It's whoever can drive the most data and the right kinds of data that Spotify wants to see. So obviously people with more money, more resources, they can, acts that have more resources, labels, they can throw more behind a new track if it does get placed on a playlist. You know, it's a game no matter what. It's a game no matter what. The idea that maybe if only a journalist could curate the playlist, or if only a certain kind of person could curate it, then it might be better. I mean, I think I disagree. I just think there's always going to be a problem when there is a curator of a playlist. A curator of anything. I mean, a record store that has a staff pick wall, Pitchfork always using the same journalists for album reviews. You know, that's a problem that is baked in to having an editorial take, or having a criteria at all for adding something to your record store wall, your editorial playlist, your album reviews, blah, blah, blah. Now, I think what's cool about like new media, just stepping aside from playlists, like Anthony Fantano, he does album reviews, but he's not pretending to be like meritocratic or even-handed in a way. He's just saying like, this is what I'm into. He puts his face behind it. He doesn't pretend to be like a Spotify top 40 playlist. It's Anthony Fantano's reviews. Another really important conversation in the context of playlists to have actually is really well put in the book, and I want to read it to you quickly. This is page 49. This is in the chapter The Conquest of Chill, which is highly relevant to the music that I make. Near the bottom of 49, similar dynamics played out with Spotify playlists more generally. Editorial playlists work for consumption, one former Spotify playlist editor told me. They don't work for creating fans. Hello. Because that's not what they're for. It's just tangential to the system. Algorithmic stuff doesn't create fans either. Playlisting was a lot of lean back passive consumption that was an end in and of itself. You had people like buying houses and staying completely independent just because of playlist consumption, but that didn't help them fill a 150 cap room or sell merch. In the previous paragraph, I'll also add, one producer who had released his music with Lo-Fi Girl, landed on some of Spotify's official lo-fi playlists, told me that despite his 300,000 monthly listeners, if he played a show in LA and promoted it really hard, maybe 20 people would come. The thing I want to hammer home is it's not just a problem of who gets to curate the playlist, it's the very structure of playlists that is kind of a big problem. It's the fact that playlists did so well and changed listening habits of, you know, listeners worldwide, but mostly Americans. It's the fact that people think in playlists now that has really moved us away from caring about artists and following individual artists and going deep on their discography. And that is something that I find really regrettable about like playlist culture, Spotify listening culture, because like a lot of other music platforms, they don't emphasize it quite as much. They still do, but just not as much. So I think that's a really important aspect of this playlist conversation.
Let's talk about, because I feel like we've glossed past something really quick, that 2012, 2013 era, that prime playlisting era, where it was really kind of ramping up and gaining influence and actually kind of like impacting the way musicians were making music and the type of music people were listening to. I have to say, in your book, I've never, I think in like, you know, one set of pages condensed, read the word chill so many times. And now my skin just fucking crawls when I think of, oh yeah, that's chill. That sounds chill. Like I catch myself now whenever I'm thinking of like, oh, how do I describe this song? I have to review it. Oh, it's kind of a chill, you know, I have to like, you know, I get nauseous when I think of chill music now. So, you know, I feel like with the way the playlists and the algorithms were working and the way that they were using the data to sort of like drive certain songs and make others more obscure and see less exposure among people, it all sort of, you know, led to this like singular direction where we were getting on these playlists like the blandest, most wallpaper, most non-attention grabbing versions of every single genre.
Yes, it's giving lo-fi girl, it's giving chilled cow, which is not the vibe. I'm not a fan of what chilled cow does. And by the way, the book does a good job of hammering this home, but chilled cow is another institution like playlist writ large that pushes people away from knowing the artist, and they focus it more on the platform and the institution. But even just thinking about the music that they push out, I mean, it ain't it.
That, you know, these playlists were being built around. If you could, for everyone who hasn't read the book yet, sort of like describe what exactly this chill vibe and energy is that Spotify was building so much of their playlist energy around and was kind of curating around.
Yeah, so the chapter that you're referencing is honestly one of my favorite chapters in the book, called The Conquest of Chill, where sort of looking at this concept of the vibes playlist as this streaming era phenomenon and trying to contextualize it within the broader history of not just mood music, but technology companies using the promise of mood stabilization through music as part of selling people on new technologies. So, you know, this is like involves in part the history of Muzak, but also other ways in which entrepreneurs in the record business since the dawn of recorded music basically have used a similar tactic. So, you know, what you're asking about is the ways in which the rise of the chill playlists in the height of this sort of, you know, I interviewed this one former Spotify employee who referred to the years 2016 to 2019 as the peak playlist era. And that was really helpful for me, actually, because there is sort of a sense these days that in a lot of ways, streaming curation has gotten much more personalized, and that the impact of these editor curated playlists, while they still exist, has kind of diminished a little bit. But there was this period of time where these editor curated playlists were really influential in the music business, and artists and labels, even in the independent music world, were really focused on, you know, getting these placements, and that they were really driving streaming revenues and making a, you know, big impact on artists and labels' ability to survive in the streaming, or, you know, thrive maybe in the streaming ecosystem. And
You know, just to finish a thought that I was saying earlier, Spotify told us over and over, like with this playlist pyramid, like, oh, we listen to every playlist submission, we listen to every bit of music you send us when you submit through the Spotify for Artists portal. They haven't changed that statement really publicly, but I mean, the reality is there is no way that they listen to all the music that's being submitted. I mean, it's an astronomical amount that's being added to the platform every day now. And also, I mean, Spotify has been cutting their employee base, a couple thousand in 2024, I believe, to a lot of people's great dismay. And so, I mean, you have to just assume that they're not even really listening to the music anymore. And anyway, Liz gets into this a little bit, but it's possible that some of the music that's ending up on playlists is being secretly generated by Spotify in ghost studios, but also in terms of just AI music generation.
something that has been interesting to me, like since that time, is the way in which the prevalence of mood-based playlists, which were specifically part of the strategy of growth, then sort of prioritize certain types of music, right? So something that you hear a lot is that artists would see in their discography is that, you know, the one song on their album that maybe like did the best on streaming was the song that was kind of maybe the mellowest or the most straightforward, or the song that would sort of work well on a coffee shop playlist or a chill vibes playlist. And
Definitely happens with Ciao Ciao.
what happens when you have a kind of curation ecosystem that is repeatedly rewarding the same types of styles is that it does sort of have this flattening effect. Maybe in some cases on the types of music that people are making, but also, certainly with how musicians conceive of what type of music is going to be successful in that environment. And it does, I think, contribute to a sort of musacking. That's the way I talk about it in my book, is that like, streaming kind of has contributed to this sort of like musacking of different
Yeah,
cultures and
a musacification, if you will.
This is so real and valid. I think it's important to name it. But just to zoom out, I mean, Spotify does a lot to influence the behavior of musicians. Another one that I know it affects me certainly with Ciao Ciao and with other projects is Spotify currently does not count a stream until after the 30-second mark. So if you think about it, any track that's under 30 seconds actually cannot be counted for streams anymore. I believe it used to, but not anymore. So maybe there were some bad actors who used to make really short tracks to try to farm streams. But the reality is, most artists who are just trying to express themselves, who maybe sometimes end up making tracks that are shorter than 30 seconds, get punished for being expressive, for playing with the form. And, in terms of Ciao Ciao, like I want to make money off the streams. And so it's a factor for me, and then on the far side of track length, I don't want to make the track too long because I only get paid per one stream, and the one stream payment is so small that I want to maximize the amount of streams I'm getting. So I'm not going to make a 10-minute long track. I'm just not going to do it because I want to keep my listener moving along. And if I get placed in a playlist, I don't want to hold the playlist up. I just want to get my stream and move on. Ideally, someone is on my page in my discography and they're streaming lots of tracks of mine. And so I'm getting more streams per session than someone who has longer tracks. I mean, it's not fun to talk about. It's not something at the front of my mind. It's not like my top priority while I'm making music under Ciao Ciao, but it's a factor. I mean, I'm not going to lie. It's a factor. And so this is all really real and important stuff to be talking about.
No, I mean it's also one of my favorite sections of the book too, because you also kind of effectively, and somebody in chat just mentioned this, kind of like that YouTube study beats kind of vibe, and what you draw an interest to, what you draw a connection to, interestingly, is something that often I will think about, because obviously I've been reviewing for so long that sometimes I'll kind of nostalgically think back to different eras or sort of like scenes or waves that had been like happening during certain points in my career, and excuse me, every once in a while my mind does go back to like that really primordial time period in the earlier 2010s, around the same time period that we're talking about, where it was like really prime creatively for like the left field instrumental hip hop beat music scene, and they were like making so much cool stuff, and Brainfeeder Records was like putting out one album after another and even though some of these projects didn't necessarily hold up as album pieces per se, people were just like eating it up and loving it. And then eventually through Spotify and through things like these YouTube streams, like someone in chat just mentioned, like there is, as you said, this flattening of all of this stuff, and it sort of like ends up screaming louder than the original scene itself for this music, and it sort of becomes like people's conception and perception of these genres. And when they want to go to listen to these sorts of sounds, they'll go to Spotify first, or they'll go to a YouTube study beats playlist first, and as a result, all of these artists who've been making these records, they're sort of being drowned out, and now there's absolutely no money anymore for them to actually make these albums unless they get placed on one of these playlists. But maybe the next topic we can get into is the AI aspect of all of this, because
okay, before the AI stuff, let's talk about lo-fi, chill, study beats. Look, There is some truth to the conversation they're having, and of course, Liz did some great journalism in the book about the chill space. But I gotta say, I mean, if you look at really any genre that has gotten big, any genre of music, I mean, what's happening with chill and lo-fi, it's kind of the same path that all these genres have taken. It starts off small, it starts off meaning something very specific. The radius of fans keeps widening. Eventually, a lot of money starts flowing in. And actually, it's important to say when it's very small and it means something specific, often there's not a lot of money washing around in the scene. And so I think Anthony might be doing a funny thing here by saying, like, oh, those artists can't make money anymore. I'm not sure they were making money, a lot of money in the first place, but putting that aside, you know, eventually so many fans come in, so many new artists flow in to make more of that music that eventually it doesn't resemble the music that was originally being made under that name. Like, you know, some classic modern examples of what I'm talking about is like indie. You know, when I was young on Napster pirating music illegally, independent music really meant something. It meant that you were not affiliated with a major label. It meant you were very DIY, and that came up not just in the sound, but more in the aesthetic and the way you went about making and spreading your music. Recorded at home, which was a lot harder back then. DIY venues, self-marketing, self-managing. But eventually the scene got so big and the vibe got so commercialized and mainstream that it came to mean a certain sound and a certain vibe. And eventually the word indie, it just doesn't even resemble hardly where you started with that word indie. We use indie now to describe artists who are on major labels. Like, I mean, think about like, I don't know, like Tame Impala or Phoebe Bridgers. Like, these are huge mainstream artists. I mean, not the biggest ever, but you know what I'm saying. They're big artists and they're not independent, technically speaking. And the other example that I have in mind is pop, right? Like, pop used to mean popular. It used to mean what was in the top 40 of radio. We maybe associated it with girl bands, boy bands of the late 90s, 2000s, synthesizers, drum machines. Okay, well, that kind of music like isn't really in the top 40 anymore, but we still call it pop. And when we use the word pop, you know, a lot of that music is still popular, but what we really mean is the sound and the aesthetic, the presentation of the music. So like Katy Perry maybe isn't in the top 40 at the time that I'm making this video, but the music she makes is nevertheless described as pop. Do you see what I'm getting at? So these genres, they start in one place, and if they get big, they move to another. In the case of pop, you know, maybe there was money at the beginning, but in the case of indie, there probably wasn't. And in the case of chill, lo-fi, I would say that there probably wasn't a lot of money like sloshing around in these lo-fi beats spaces. Now, I have a sort of next order thing to add to this, because this is where I have found success with Ciao Ciao, is actually the space is so flooded, but there's still a lot of listeners in that area that there's actually, I feel like, a market opportunity. And I hate to speak in these like business terms, but just stay with me for a second. Like, there's so much bad music being made in this space, like the chill lo-fi space, that I feel there's actually an opportunity to circle back and actually make music, even if it doesn't resemble the traditional sound that's associated with that genre, but to go in from an excited and authentic place and make music and label it chill and lo-fi, and recapture the love from the listeners who are really into that sound, and stand apart and just like really put in a lot of effort and care into the music. And that's what I've done with Ciao Ciao. And so actually, Ciao Ciao is a 2-year-old project. And, you know, some might say it's late to be entering the chill lo-fi space, but I've found a lot of success. It depends what you view matters about calling things a name. I mean, it matters more at the beginning, I would say, than it does later on. A lot of times when we're using genre words, it's to expedite conversation. It's not to make a formal statement about the music. Like maybe in you know, Europe a few hundred years ago, there were some very specific names that meant something about structure, or maybe for certain folk traditions, there are certain boundaries that you really do want to stay inside in order to call your music like a certain kind of folk music or from a certain place. That's fine. I'm not trying to like destroy or erode those definitions. But what I am saying is, you know, in terms of like mainstream uh, markets, just music markets, and in the business sense, like these music terms don't really mean much. Like we should just be making the music we're excited about, and then finding the affinity groups after.
You also say in the book, like it's becoming harder and harder to get placements on these playlists and others because they're being more and more chock full of AI music instead of music made by actual artists.
Yeah, and you know, just to kind of like respond to something that you just said too, to me, there's this small section in that chapter that I just mentioned where I kind of interviewed a bunch of producers who have made music in the lo-fi hip hop space, who talked
Right.
about the impact that playlistification has had on that scene over the years. And I think that something that really stuck with me was one of the producers that I interviewed talked about how in the streaming era, it became really easy to reach a really wide audience through these curated playlists, but it became harder to make meaningful connections or feel that you had like, you know,
So real.
that anyone listening, you know, would remember your artist project, or that listening to these playlists would cause anyone to go like, you know, actually research who the artists on the playlists were. And this has happened with various different scenes over the years where the prominence of a really popular playlist will make it, you know, easier for people to become fans of a specific playlist or a sound and not necessarily dig further into learning about the artists on those playlists. And I think that that severing of the relationship between listener and artist that sometimes happens when streaming platforms shape listening behavior around their own discovery tools is one of the big sort of like things to be mindful of in this environment, or to you know, put our attention on, is like how when a streaming service works to sort of shape listening behavior around one of its own tools, it kind of like cuts out that relationship in some ways.
Liz is hitting on something really important, which I already mentioned earlier, which is that like playlisting disconnects the relationship of the listener and the artist. But you know, I just want to come back to this idea of like, oh, Spotify has really ruined things and we need to like save the music industry and like go back and save what it was. Well, I mean, I'm sorry, like what the music industry was didn't create any space for any of these lo-fi chill producers or a person like me making music like Ciao Ciao. We wouldn't have been finding very many fans or making all that much music in the old way either. And so while playlisting is a problem, I just want to point out that it's in general, just in the most general sense, it's never been a better time to find fans. So what does it boil down to with playlists? I think if you were relying on playlists as your main source of income, you were in trouble. Always, even when things were going well, it was always a vulnerable situation to be in. The goal should always, like any time in the music industry history, the goal should always to try to find the fans one way or another and grab a hold of them and try to get a one-on-one relationship with them. So it doesn't always ring true to me if an artist is going to cry about like playlists not taking care of 360 degrees of their music career, because that's not what that's never what any one thing in the music industry was ever going to do. And in terms of Ciao Ciao, like I have never made playlists a goal in terms of editorials or sort of algorithmically curated playlists. What I've always done is just try to drive interest from fans one by one. It's much slower, but it's much more organic. And the reality is, the truth of that has always been in place in every generation of the music industry. So there's no way to get around. You have to find fans if you want to last long term. What does it look like to not just rely on playlists in the modern era? For me, it means social media. It means maybe doing more shows, and sometimes unsuccessfully, but you have to just show up and give whatever small amount of fans you have an opportunity to appreciate you. You just have to build it from there. You have to respond to the comments. You have to respond to the DMs. You can't just cry about Spotify not taking care of everything for you. That was never going to happen before the rise of the playlist era. After, now, here, as we're entering an era that's not quite as driven by playlists. I don't know what comes next in terms of the tech and the online manifestation, but I do know that connecting with fans one way or another is gonna be the trick. So just keep that in mind, like, as we listen to this conversation. It has always been hard, and it will always be hard.
What the music industry calls, and for years has been calling like lean back listening or passive listening, or I would just say it's kind of the impact of playlistification in general. In some ways, because it has contributed to these dynamics where people aren't as maybe concerned with what actual artists they're listening to, and they're just going for a specific vibe or specific mood or specific playlist, it does make it a lot easier for services to slip in, like, music made by generative AI, or maybe like music. I have 2 chapters of the book about what I like refer to as ghost artists, or this kind of like so-called fake artist phenomenon on Spotify that people have been talking about for, like a decade now.
It's real.
And when the relationship between the listener and the artist has kind of been like, cut off that way, it makes it unfortunately like a lot easier for these companies to normalize prioritizing content that is cheaper for them, which I think is one of the main reasons why tech companies and the music business is interested in AI music, is because there's this promise of cheaper content, and that's certainly, as people who care about music, like something to be critical of.
And furthermore, like, just to put a really fine point on it, there's an antitrust issue with this. I mean, Spotify shouldn't be allowed to generate music for their own platform. It's a conflict of interest. It's antitrust. Like, Spotify shouldn't be allowed to have any sort of label-like institutions that they create. It just all stinks. It stinks.
I guess one other thing I always like to point out with the conversations about generative AI and AI also more broadly is that, there are a lot of concerns and there's a lot of hype around generative AI right now. And it's absolutely like legitimate, artists and people who care about music should be really concerned with the ways in which music is being used without artists' consent in training generative AI music systems in order to create cheaper content and display in these curatorial systems. I also think it's important to remember all of the ways that AI and machine learning have reshaped the way that we discover music and understand music, and the way meaning is created in music through things like algorithmic recommendation and this kind of, like I talk about in the introduction, this kind of like mechanized way of listening to music or discovering music that has become advanced in the streaming era.
Yes.
Yeah, there's even in regards to the AI music on the platform, a pretty hilarious part of the book where you draw like, or you kind of dig up a really funny irony that, there are sort of found instances of AI music on the platform being streamed or sort of like engaged with by bots. So you just like literally have robots listening to robots. There's like literally no fucking human in the loop at
Dead internet theory. Look it up.
Any point.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, that was, I thought, like a really telling example of, I think in the book I ask, like, is this kind of just like the logical conclusion of where
Right.
all these like mechanized ways of thinking about making music and listening to music leads to
Oh man,
eventually?
so dark.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, people are bringing up in the chat the dead internet theory, which I mean does like kind of
There you
connect to
go.
this for sure. The first of which I kind of see like three big tiers of the industry at this point, and they're the record labels, you have the streaming services, and you also have the distros, like DistroKid, and eventually at some point, as dog eat dog capitalism, always gradually does, like one ends up swallowing the other. And I don't know, for me, maybe it's the distros, but who may it be in your opinion? Do you think eventually one of these three will get absorbed into the other and we'll see even more consolidation of the music industry?
Something that I talk about in the introduction and try to make clear throughout the book is that a lot of when we're criticizing streaming services or talking about streaming services, you're also talking about the major record labels who are partners in, many ways to these
Yeah,
companies.
they are connected, and they have a stake in the company as far as stocks and everything, to the tune of millions and millions of dollars.
Very. And they pay Spotify different prices to have their catalogs on the platform. They operate under a completely different set of rules. They're starting to get closer and closer every day.
Yeah, the major labels make so much money off of the streaming ecosystem. The streaming model, as we know it, could not exist without the cooperation and participation of the major record labels. So in a lot of ways, like the types of industry practices that we're talking about and the dynamics that we're talking about, it's, as I write in the introduction, like it's as much about what's stayed the same as it is about what's changed. The major labels have incredible influence and power in the music business. And it's hard to imagine a situation where that is not true unless there is some sort of like, massive wave of antitrust action or some
That's
sort of
right.
like efforts to investigate and
I
sort
mean,
of regulate these companies.
come on. I mean, it's not going to happen under the Trump administration, but come on. There's a serious antitrust issue.
So it's hard to imagine like that not being the case. Something that is interesting is that you see like, something else I say is that a lot of the economics of streaming and the story of streaming, I think, could be understood as a fight for market share. And the labels and the major rights holders, because of the pro rata model in which rights holders get paid through streaming, rights holders are always trying to grow their market share, or as streaming services call it, stream share, like the number of total streams that they have on a platform in a given royalty period. And because of that, you've seen like a lot of investment on the major labels, from the major labels into like independent distributors and these sort of like companies that allow independent labels to have more of a foot in like the so-called like DIY distribution realm. So I don't really like to future cast or make predictions about
Hmm.
like these sort of big players in the music business, but it's not hard to imagine a world where the major labels just like continue trying to buy up and consolidate more corners of independent distribution. And
Yeah, Liz is such an amazing thinker about all of this. And I really just want to, again, recommend the book, Mood Machine. But in this case, I just want to stress, like I said, it's never been easier to find fans and have your weird music make its way to people. It's never been a better time. As someone, take it from someone who grew up in the 90s and 2000s, like a time when it was like fucking impossible to get your music heard. But at the same time, we are up against so much more as small musicians, independent musicians in my case, but even if you're a small musician at a label, you're just up against so much more because these major labels and just lots of outside companies in general are also trying to push old catalogs that they've bought. So a lot of these playlists, but just these platforms writ large, are getting flooded with like zombie music catalogs. I mean, some of the music is beloved and has, organic listenership, but on top of that, it's also being pushed um, by these very powerful companies and institutions that are pressuring the platforms, or in some cases not even pressuring, just working hand in glove with them. So I just want to say, like, I see it and I recognize it. It's really really hard right now.
I mean,
And it,
in the book, you do cite instances, at least, of like the labels taking interest in sort of like owning some of these distros, and it all sort of it seems like there is at least some consolidation for sure at play. Um,
I hear that, and of course, labels already do distribute, uh, you know, privately, you could say, for their own artists that they've signed. Uh, I don't, I don't know that that is what's going to happen, just because currently the streaming platforms are so disparate that it's there is currently a very real need for middlemen distributors to make it easy for artists. DistroKid has its problems, trust me, but I do use it, and simply in a transactional way to just put my music up and get money out of it and just have my information held in one place for all the different kinds of music that I do. I find it extremely effective, and it's better than the insanity that we had to deal with in the 2000s and early 2010s. Just if you weren't there, just trust me, it's way better now. And so I don't really see it changing in the near future. Maybe way further in the future, there could be a totally different structure to the industry.
Another thing that I was kind of wondering if you had done any research into this, I don't remember it being discussed deeply in the book, but something I've always kind of like questioned about Spotify's presentation versus almost any other streaming platform is why do you think they make such a big deal of like posting the numbers on the platform in terms of like, yeah, these
Oh,
are the monthly listeners, and not just for the artists, of course, like they would see them, but these are the monthly listeners for your favorite artist. And here's how each song is, getting streamed and how many hits it has and so on and so forth. And, usually I don't see that being so much the case on other platforms. And given Spotify's lack of transparency on pretty much every other issue, and also like, the major labels, various connections and monetary vested interests in Spotify. Like, do we even have reason as outsiders to trust any of these numbers? Like, could all of this be totally made the fuck up? Or is it like verified in any way outside of like, some reporting to the Music Industry of America and just, the Association of American, oh yeah, this went platinum. It's doing really well. It's great. So yeah, I mean, should we trust these numbers, or is there reasoning behind showing these numbers to the public on Spotify's part?
well, it's interesting because I think that we definitely should like question the value of these numbers. Like I always say, like streaming metrics, data that comes from streaming services isn't necessarily data about music. It's data about that streaming service. There's so many examples of artists that have horrible streaming numbers, but that could play a sold out show in New York to 250
absolutely.
people. And then examples of musicians that have millions of streams that if they did a show in New York, like not even 10 people would show up. And I think that's one of the really
Absolutely.
strange thing about how streaming metrics, if you talk to musicians, they'll tell you that streaming metrics have become such like an important part of how they get booked, or if certain like people in the music industry will take them seriously, when we know that
Yes.
like there's such like a indirect correlation between what these numbers can actually tell us about like true fandom and musical community. So
Yeah.
That is so spot on. And I feel like there's so many really important things like all tangled up in that, like very simple statement. Um, Liz is so good. Read the book. First thing, we need to normalize the idea that a music act could have a small online presence, online following, small online impact, and have a huge IRL fan base. I mean, it feels intuitively true for a lot of older acts, but it's true for a lot of newer acts too, and we need to hold in our minds that that's possible. And then we also, I just want to kind of take the stigma out of anything you might be getting from this conversation. I think we should also normalize that someone should be allowed to have like an exclusively online career if they want to. In fact, like I'm kind of teetering, like I seesaw back and forth all the time about like how much IRL stuff I want to do with Ciao Ciao Marigold. If you go check out my channel, you'll see that I've already done a live show with Ciao Ciao that went really well. Walking to the subway, it's actually like noon on the dot. If you're not honking. And the footage of that show is even up on the Ciao Ciao channel. But I actually don't know how much live stuff I really want to do. And I want it to be normal and like not stigmatized to be able to make the choice of just being online. Actually, that said, like it's a lot harder to make like a much larger long-term living off just online income because streaming doesn't pay so well. So I, of course, want to acknowledge that, but like, let's just let both possibilities be real. Small online, big IRL, small IRL, big online. But that last thing that Liz said is so true. And it's like pushing all of us to make our online numbers as big as possible because we are judged by these numbers. You could have a big follower count, for example, on IG and get lots of bookings, even if like you click in on a person's posts who has a lot of followers, you might notice that they don't get a lot of engagement with their posts. But it's just that like big fat number on top of followers that like lights up bookers and agents' eyes. And I think that's a little sus. I'm not into that. I think we should get away from that, but I don't know how to. Before I continue on the video, I also just want to point out, I just want to underline and pull out something that's really interesting that's happening for us right now with Spotify, which is, yeah, the numbers are still publicly available information. I mean, they might be juiced a little here and there, but I think by and large they're like pretty accurate in the most general sense. Like something that's popular, you'll see good numbers for it, and something that's not, you won't. But it is pretty crazy that we can see those numbers. I mean, currently Apple Music, you have no visibility into it. I mean, there's really no other platform besides maybe SoundCloud where you can see those numbers. And I think that's amazing. Like we shouldn't like rag on Spotify until they take away the numbers because then it'll just go behind this like wall that only the musicians and their labels and their teams can see. And I think it's actually really helpful for us, for like from musician to musician, from team to team, to be able to see what's going on the biggest listening platform in the world. If you think about like Netflix is so opaque. It's like a gardened wall. We just have to wait for their like yearly and quarterly reports for them to tell us like, and they don't even tell us the numbers when they do. They just say like, oh, this was our most popular movie on the platform. Was our most popular TV show. Well, what does most popular mean? Is it on Netflix? Is it more popular than anything that was on TV that month? Like, you know, is it more popular than anything on YouTube? Like, we have no way of knowing what the raw numbers for Netflix are. Watch time, streams overall, da-da-da. You know what I'm saying? And so that's not good. We don't want that. And another thing that is pretty unique with the music industry that if you haven't thought about this, I want to bring this to your attention. With all other streaming platforms, there's a limit to the amount of content. Like all these streaming platforms, like for video, Netflix, Max, Paramount Plus, Hulu, they all have exclusive licenses to certain pieces of content, and those pieces of content move on and off pretty fluidly from the platforms. But as someone who didn't grow up with this, it is pretty amazing that a large portion of recorded music is available on all of these platforms equally. Like there's not, I mean, of course you'll be able to name cases like Frank Ocean's Endless, like is only on, what is it, Apple Music or Tidal, whatever. There are certain cases where there's only some music on some platforms, but these platforms have just a huge amount of overlapping music, and that is an amazing thing about the market that I think we shouldn't be so quick to yell at all these platforms for the way they operate, because like, for example, in the case of Spotify, having so much music available and having the numbers publicly visible is pretty amazing and pretty helpful at the moment. Now, make no mistake, I'm not defending Spotify overall. There's so much that needs to change. It's insane. And we need to work towards that. But I don't want some of these things to go away, like having so much music available and having the numbers publicly visible.
It makes sense that they're so prominent for streaming services because in a lot of ways, kind of like the core way in which these services determine value. Like if these services are driven by a need to, to bolster engagement, like everything that they do is driven by wanting to boost user engagement, keep people streaming more, keep people, extend listening sessions. So it makes sense that there would be this kind of, so much value put on data in this environment.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest half truths that I see all the time in terms of like the monthly listener numbers on any given artist page is like, you'll go to an artist page, you'll see they have a certain amount of monthly listeners, and you'll see the tracks that are sort of like getting them that kind of engagement. And sometimes over and over and over, it'll be features on other people's songs, and you and I as music fans know that doesn't necessarily always sort of like translate to an actual fan who's engaging with your stuff. People may be streaming that track that you're featured on because they're a fan of that artist that you collaborated with. And yet on a lot of these platforms, including Spotify, this is like showcases this is this artist's work, this thing that they featured on. And, this we sort of consider to be like a prime piece of their catalog, even though it may just be like a guest appearance, and it sort of like counts toward their overall monthly engagement with everyone, as if, something like, let's say, I don't know, a Drake feature, for example. Drake has been known to sort of like be this guy who, for a quick moment, he drives a lot of people into the direction of a certain person or a certain figure or a certain artist by having them feature on a track, and they blow up for a minute, and then, it sort of ramps down pretty quickly. And it sort of seems like, in a way, like the streaming services are kind of like also, I don't know, part of that web effect, that domino effect of like, this person has 11 million monthly listeners on Spotify, but as you say, they try to book a tour and they have to cancel the whole thing because they can't fill up the venues that they're booking.
It's so real. All of that is so true. Let me just also jujitsu that into saying we as artists can hijack that fact to our advantage, maybe. So for example, like when I make Ciao Ciao tracks, sometimes I will tag my producer moniker, 12 Tone, and the Spotify page of 12 Tone will perform better because of that. And maybe I can even, over time, siphon, well, that's kind of a negative way of putting it, but just encourage people to discover 12 Tone through Ciao Ciao. And in this way, once I start doing it with friends and other artists that I want to be associated with algorithmically, I can send some traffic their way, boost their numbers, maybe not send some literal fan traffic, but just send some algorithmic traffic their way, make their page look better. Then maybe as they make more stuff, it helps grow their page. And as more fans flow to them, they start finding the Ciao Ciao collabs and they come back. Some kind of algorithmic stuff comes back my way. Look, I'm not saying I'm the first person to think of this. I'm just naming something in terms of taking the architecture of Spotify algorithmically and using it to your advantage. Like maybe this is opening up ideas for you. Maybe you want to make a producer page like I did, and it can be a catch-all for all kinds of tracks you make, but when one thing is successful, it can raise algorithmic awareness to other stuff you're making. Or maybe you're part of a collective and you have friends that you want to tag on the tracks. It's almost like tagging friends in a post, you know? Look, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of social media, but maybe the way to think of Spotify is more like social media in terms of just how we operate on it, not being as precious, and especially since we can put up and take things down a lot more easily these days, let's just try to take advantage of the system for what it is. Okay, I'm stopping here. You should watch the rest of the video, which is called Spotify Doesn't Want You to See This. Anthony Fantano interviewing Liz Pelly, amazing music journalist. Her book is called Mood Machine. You should definitely buy it and read it. I highly recommend it. See you in the next video.